What's up? How's it going? Have you ever heard of the Flying Spaghetti Monster? Some of you might be thinking, what in the marinara sauce is the Flying Spaghetti Monster? Well, it's a parody that's essentially tries to say if we believe in a creator or gods or something like that, we might as well say that it's a flying spaghetti monster. So I want to do three things in today's video. Number one, to think about parody as a tool. Number two, to try to figure out what the main points were that Bobby Henderson was trying to make as he wrote throughout his book. And number three, to offer up some things to consider in response to the main points that Bobby Henderson was trying to make. First, let's think about parody. If you want a good laugh, check out The Onion. It's a satirical news source that tries to expose something ridiculous about today's society. Satire is not a new art form. One of my favorite satires in history is written by this guy named Voltaire a few hundred years ago in a short story named Candide. A bunch of people in Voltaire's day were claiming that God made the world and therefore the world as it exists today must be the greatest possible world. So instead of writing some super scholarly essay on the possible worlds and all that, Voltaire sits down and writes a satire named Candide, and he has a few laughs along the way. My first point is that satire alone is cowardly. Anyone can be a critic. Anyone can watch TV and holler at Tom Brady and tell him how wrong he's throwing the football. But it's another thing to offer up a better way to Tom Brady to throw than what he's already doing. So anyone can be a critic, but it takes real guts to make a claim that does a better job of explaining the things that we observe and the things that we experience. The last book we looked at was An Agnostic Perspective on the Historical Jesus, written by Bart Ehrman. So in it, he raises some doubts about the historical Jesus and about who he was and the things that he claimed. Ehrman not only raises doubts, but actually makes an honest attempt at an alternate claim. And for that, I respect him. Satire can be healthy, but this book, The Flying Spaghetti Monster, is extremely crude. Now, I'm not personally offended, but I'm sure some people might feel offended by some of the things in the book. And there's plenty of lighthearted stuff in the book as well. So, what did the book say? It seemed that throughout Henderson's writing, he was trying to make these 5 basic points and trying to get those across. So let's see what they were. Number one, that there's no good reason for God. Number two, that the Christian idea of God is lame. The third is that belief is a mental prison. The fourth one is that certainty leads to arrogance. And the fifth one is that it's all made up and the points don't matter. So what I want to do is I want to consider each of these, trying to see what points he made, and not necessarily in order, and then go from there. So let's first talk about belief and certainty. All right, so the baddest of bad words, according to the Flying Spaghetti Monster, is dogma. Okay, so all dogma is a set of, kind of like an organized set of beliefs. So as I was reading the book, I kind of organized some thoughts, and here's kind of what I wrote down as what I discerned to be Henderson's perspective. We can't know anything about God. It's all Santa Claus and unicorns. It's all wishful thinking in order to make us be good little boys and girls. We might as well say it's a flying spaghetti monster. People who believe in a God are imprisoned in this mental box called dogma, which does not allow you to think your own thoughts. People are stuck in these mental boxes, thus claim they believe in a creator, and they obnoxiously claim 100% certainty about everything. In this view, to claim to know anything is obnoxious. On one hand, there are plenty of obnoxious folks out there who might claim 100% certainty on all topics. But on the other hand, I say that it is possible to hold multiple things with varying levels of certainty. And it's not arrogant necessarily to claim certainty on maybe one thing. For example, let's check out what he says on page 98. He says, our principles preclude us from knowing any truths. And what I would simply say in response to that is, you sure? Because this is a self-defeating statement. On one hand, he's saying our principles, which is another way of saying we know something, And at the end of it, he says, we can't know anything. And then he goes on later to say, instead, we make a strong argument for our beliefs with the realization that we could be wrong. And that, I would say, yeah, let's go with that. You can believe something with the realization that you can be wrong, but don't make this statement that you can't know anything, because it's self-defeating. Now for this idea that to believe in Christianity is to be in a mental prison. And to respond to this, I'd like for you to think about my job here for a second. See, I'm a high school physics teacher. All right, those poor students, they're stuck with me, right? All right, so anyways, I have things that I'm mandated by the state that I teach in that I have to teach. And there's some things that I'm forbidden to teach. For example, I cannot teach that heavy things fall faster than light things based on their mass. But that doesn't imply that I'm in some mental or professional cage or prison, that my creative abilities are now crippled. There's also some things that I can't teach that are disagreed upon by physicists. For instance, most physicists agree that energy, momentum, Newton's laws are all pretty important, but some disagree on, say, like the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. All right, but that's okay. They made a mature decision on whether that's relevant or not for high schoolers. And some people might disagree, but at the end of the day, it's okay. To say that I have to teach Galileo's concept of inertia means that I'm not a free thinker is a really, really weak definition of what it means to be free. On the one hand, I don't want to just believe everything that everybody says, and on the other hand, I don't want to just doubt everything in the universe, so that I can find some middle ground to where I can have some productive, enjoyable, and meaningful life. All right, so the next thing that I want to talk about here is the it's all made up and the points don't matter. Because he says something on page 129 that I think is pivotal. All right, so he says on page 129, almost in passing, that the only way to know the Creator is by studying nature. And what I would say is that, sure, that's a good way, but it's not the best way, but it is maybe a good and useful way for a little bit. Okay, so I've got an analogy for you, and I want you to hang with me for just a minute. So here's my drawing. I want you to point out, this is my wife's drawing, this is Voltaire, and this is Da Vinci. Okay, so I would argue that if, let's say we want to know some things about Da Vinci, okay, I'm sure there's tons of stuff that we could deduce about who he is. All right, by the way, the Dos Equis guy got nothing on this cool dude. So we could study his anatomical drawings, we could study his paintings, and we could study his writing about physics and biology and all this stuff, and we would know a lot about Da Vinci, but we may not know who he is. Okay, so we might not know what kinds of things he likes, what kinds of things frustrate him, what kinds of things makes him laugh, what kinds of things does he say all the time. All right, so if I want to know Da Vinci, sure, I can learn plenty of things about Da Vinci by studying his works and all that good stuff, but I still may not know who he is. All right, and kind of another thought along with that is, what if his original creation is not the way that it was created? What if we're looking at a broken, distorted part of its original glory and awesomeness? And that's what brings me to the most beautiful claim that Jesus makes. It's essentially, what if the author of this whole thing, the Shakespeare of this whole thing, if I'm going to get to know the Da Vinci behind this, what if he wrote himself into this great story and shows up like Stan Lee in some glorious cameo? So what if the author wants to speak for himself? And that brings me to one of the most beautiful claims of Jesus. So let's check out the beginning of the Gospel of John. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him not anything was made that was made. And then a little bit later on it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We have seen his glory, glory as from the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Then another book a little bit later in Hebrews, it says, long ago at many times in many ways God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom he also created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God in the exact imprint of his nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. So it's like if I want to know something about the author, or if you want to know something about me, sure, you can look at my bank account or whatever. But you could also just talk to me, and that seems to be a much more meaningful way to get to know me. Let's think for a second about what Jesus actually claimed. So he said, before Abraham was, I am. And all the Jews go crazy. At another time he says, he says that he is greater than the temple. He says the temple is going to be torn down in 3 days and we'll rebuild it. And for the Jews, the temple was where God was. So that's where God's made his presence manifested. So he's saying that he's better than the presence of God in the temple. That's a pretty big statement. So the reason I bring this up is because with Jesus, he's in the claims that he makes, if Jesus really did die and really was risen from the grave like he said he would, then you have the author of this stepping into the stage that he made. But if he didn't raise from the dead, then Jesus is just a nutcase and we can ignore, and it really is all made up and the points don't matter.